Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. This is probably going to be a fairly brief video, just kind of going over some things that have been in the news as far as Micro Four Thirds is concerned. And I just wanted to say a little something. You know, I kind of focus on Lumix cameras in these videos, but I am not a brand snob. I mean, I'm kind of brand agnostic. The reason that I use Lumix cameras is when I switched over from Canon, I just found them to be fairly easy to adapt to. That doesn't mean that I think that there's anything wrong with any other brand, including the OMD, formerly Olympus cameras and system. I mean, that's a great system. That's great cameras. This new 90 millimeter macro lens looks really interesting. I'm kind of surprised that neither OMD, Olympus, or Panasonic Lumix did something like that sooner. Because if you look at full frame cameras, there are a fair number of 180 millimeter macro options for those systems. That touches on something that I think is a little bit of an issue with the Micro Four Thirds world, and that is that there's some incompatibility between the OMD and the Lumix side as far as lenses and bodies and working together. I think people remember the issues that Olympus shooters had, OMD shooters had, with the Lumix 7-14, the ultra-wide zoom, getting purple blobs, and that's because that's corrected for on Lumix cameras and wasn't for the OMD cameras. But I think that's been resolved. I think they're actually sharing aberration information so that they can correct each other's lenses. That's my impression. But of course, the other incompatibilities have to do with stabilization. So neither system, if you have an image stabilized lens on either system, they will not work with the other system's in-body image stabilization to do what Panasonic calls dual IS and what OMD calls sync IS. You have to essentially choose one or the other lens or in-body anytime you have mixed combinations. It's too bad. The Olympus lens that I think is most interesting to me is the 12-100 f4. I've read great things about it and seen some really good pictures, but because of that incompatibility, I haven't, and I really don't want to spend the money on it. You know, I haven't gone that route. The other incompatibility is that if you're using an Olympus lens on a OMD, if you're using an OMD lens on a Lumix body, Olympus doesn't supply the out-of-focus characteristics of their lenses to Panasonic, so you don't get DFD autofocusing on a Panasonic body. And I think that that's maybe not a huge issue. There seem to be a fair number of people who are using Olympus lenses on Panasonics and finding the autofocus acceptable. Now that's something that once phase detect autofocus trickles down to the Micro Four Thirds system is not going to be as much of an issue, because then Panasonic body will just use phase detect autofocus, and it's not going to matter what the autofocus characteristics are on a lens, since it's not going to be using DFD. But that actually brings up sort of another thing as far as brands and formats. And recently I've seen a couple of articles talking about format comparisons, and I'll link to these in the description. You know, there are people who just absolutely just think that full frame is just, you know, far superior to anything smaller. And of course, full frame is a silly name, because of course every camera is full frame, unless you're talking about, you know what's not full frame? The LX100 and the Mark II. They actually have an image circle smaller than the sensor. They're not full frame. And of course, medium format cameras have a larger image sensor than full frame. I think that if you and this is borne out by people on YouTube who have done this. If you make a print from a Micro Four Thirds camera and compare it to a print from a full frame camera, similar lighting, similar conditions, and you're careful with your technique, it's really hard to tell the difference. Are there things that a full frame camera or a larger sensor do better? Yeah, sure. You can shoot at a higher ISO than you can in dim light than you can with a smaller sensor camera like Micro Four Thirds. However, the faster lenses, faster prime lenses for Micro Four Thirds are less expensive than faster prime lenses for full frame. Anyway, the articles that I saw. First one is by Kirk Tuck at the Visual Science Lab, visualsciencelab.com. He is a professional photographer in Austin, Texas, and he's had this blog, Visual Science Lab, for a long time. I don't always read it religiously, but I pop in from time to time and see what he's talking about. And I just happen to see somebody mentioning his article about format, where he talks about that he has used everything. Micro Four Thirds from even smaller format, compact digital cameras up to medium format. And he just thinks it doesn't matter. It just really comes down to it doesn't matter that much. And I tend to agree with him. I shot full frame. I shot APS-C. I think these folks that you see on YouTube that are touting full frame, if you want to notice something, most of them are pretty young, maybe into their 40s. But what happens to people, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter where you were born, what country you live in, you're going to get old. And the older you get, the less, at least for me, the less I want to lug a bunch of stuff around. So, hence, moving to a smaller format system. Then people will say the G9, which I am filming on right now, is about the same size as a larger format camera. Yeah, it is. It's about the size of an 70D or 80D, a Canon. The lenses are smaller. Overall, it's a lighter system, and I find it to be very capable. The other article was on PetaPixel, an article by Jaron Schneider, and mentioning the new OMD 90mm and that it's producing stunning results, and kind of calling people out on how silly it is to look down their noses at Micro Four Thirds. And of course, he wrote this article, and then in the comments, there were your typical full frame people coming in. I mean, out loads of them. But there were some pretty good responses. The other thing I found was really interesting was a commenter who said that they had gone to a G9 from the Canon 70D, which I had. I had the 70D and the 80D. And saying they went back to the Canon because the dynamic range of the G9 just wasn't as good. And I mean, I'm immediately scratching my head because I'm like going, the 70D did not have good dynamic range. I shot JPEG a lot with the 70D rather than RAW. And the reason was at the time I was using Apple Aperture, which was may it rest in peace. That was a great, great program. There was one issue, though, compared to Lightroom, and that is that its noise reductions was not as good as what Lightroom could do. And so what I found was with the 70D and also the Canon SL1, which had the 70D was the first dual pixel autofocus camera. It was a 20 megapixel APS-C sensor. I also had the little Canon SL1, which had the 18 megapixel. That camera had noise in the shadows. It did. So I would tend to shoot JPEG because the JPEGs, the noise was taken care of. That's the one thing about JPEGs from a camera manufacturer. They know their sensor. I mean, the camera manufacturer knows the sensor they're using, especially Canon, since they make their sensors. So it was weird. You get a JPEG out of the Canon 70D or the SL1, shadows look great. Shot RAW, you had to futz around with it in Aperture, and actually, I think did I get Noise Ninja? I got a third-party plugin to deal with it, but a lot of the time I was just like, nah, screw it, I'm just going to shoot JPEG. And if you look at the measurements as far as dynamic range, The sensor in the G9 has around 13 stops. It's pretty good. You can really pull shadows up on a G9. The 70D is maybe 11. So I don't know what that guy was seeing, but that's just like, in fact, even the old 16 megapixel chip in the GX85 had better shadow recovery than the Canon 70D. The 80D was better. I still think that the G9 is better than the 80D as far as shadow recovery. And as far as high ISO, I think the results I get out of the G9 and the G95 up to 6400 pretty much match what I could get out of the 80D. So I don't worry too much about that. Anyway, I'll link to those articles down in the description. I'm going to have a really busy next week or so. So I may not be putting up another video until the week after that. I've got our local suburban paper here is starting to use freelancers. So I've got like 3 freelance photojournalist gigs coming up this weekend. Haven't done that in a while, so that'll be interesting. And I also have next week 2 full afternoon headshot gigs for a company here in the western suburbs of Chicago. So that's going to be kind of one of those, get them in, sit them down, get the headshots, get them out, get another person in, get the headshots. So it's going to be bam, 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 bam. So that's going to take up most of my time. I'm Todd Banner. I will see you next time, which may be a week or 2.